Hi, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to make the chevron stitch knit throw, and it is a reversible pattern. It's just the opposite. It uses just knits and purls to create the chevron pattern, and as you can see it lays flat, both sides are the same. I made this with Caron 1 Pound yarn in off-white. The first one I made, I did a medium gray, and I wouldn't use any darker yarn than that, or this pattern is more subtle than the checkerboard. It won't show up very well. So I measured off, because the gray one, I realized that I had barely enough on the ball. I had measured out at 1,220 feet. And I had quite a bit left in my skeins in here, with my little jars inside, keep them from collapsing. So this time I measured off 1,250 feet. I have this much left in my ball. And my ball weighed 1 pound, 6.5 ounces. These skeins are generous. So I wouldn't just measure off 1.5 pounds or you'll run out. Now, I did not make a center pull ball. I just did it, wound it on the outside. And that's, you can do either, but make sure you're doing it the direction that it doesn't get twisted up. I prefer that actually, because it just kind of untwists itself in the bin. Now, there's a couple little idiosyncrasies, if you remember, about using multiple strands. Let me sit down in a chair, and you want to remember to keep an eye on your yarn so that it doesn't over twist. Again, you can always try a different way of winding your ball of yarn, or you can work from 6 skeins, or as you're making your stitches, twist your yarn slightly in the opposite direction of the twist that's happening in your working yarn, and it will come out eventually. Now, when you see this pattern, you're going to think, oh, this is way too hard, you don't want to do it. This was super easy. I made a bunch of mistakes on the first one, and I'm going to show you in the next video how to fix a mistake that's way down in your knitting. I don't have any, but we'll pretend. The point being, if you looked at this pattern, you'd say, oh, I don't want to do that pattern, that looks like a pain. And that's why you want to knit from a chart. When you are knitting a pattern that has a lot of diagonals or triangles or diamond shapes, it's actually easier to knit from a chart. So I wrote this out. This is chevron stitch for rods transposed from a straight knitting needle pattern. And you're going to need a multiple of 8 stitches plus 1. I added 2 edge stitches for a 19 total for my chart. Now in reality, I have 43 stitches on here. But what I want to show you is that this pattern begins and ends each row the same way, other than the first stitch. And when you read from a chart, you're going to start, in my case, I started on this right-hand side, because when I cast on to my right-hand needle, or right-hand rod, and I needed about 12 feet for my tail before you make your slip knot, and I used a long tail cast on. And I added a slip stitch edge, just like we did on the checkerboard. So, if you notice, these first 2 rows, row 1, which starts here, and row 2, which starts here, are exactly the same. And that's true for row 3 and row 4, row 5 and 6, 7 and 8. So the first odd number repeats on the first even number, if you will. And to begin knitting by doing a chart, and if you want this chart, by the way, I will scan this, and if you want to send me an email and just ask for chevron stitch for rods, and I'll send it as an attachment to you. I don't have a website, so I can't send it, any other way. You can't get it any other way. Or if you took a photo of it, I bet that would work. I don't know how you take a photo, watch the video, but you know what I'm saying.
What's your email address?
Laura's Busy Corner at gmail.com. And I'm still going to put the pattern in my description, as always, and my email address again. But so just email me and put this as the subject so I'll know it's not spam. Now, for me, so I don't get confused, I actually like to see the whole pattern. And if you're creating your own pattern, you might want to write it out for the whole length of stitches. So I have 43 stitches on my rod, and I've done the whole pattern out. Notice that as you expand it, these end stitches don't change. It needs to look like that on both ends, on the left and right. but it's as the stitches elongate. So again, you just need a multiple of 8 plus 1 plus your edge stitches if you want to do those. And that's what I knit from. And when you read from a chart, you want something to be, a straight edge or something. You can pick these things, these stir sticks up at the Lowe's, and they already have little markings on there for a ruler, and that can be your straight edge. And when you read from a chart, you want to start at the bottom, just like we did when we made the rugs, and put your straight edge above the line of knitting that you're working from. And I know in this case that I've circled where I began, so I want to start right here on this corner. So the first thing I did was slip the first stitch, as we did on the checkerboard, and I'll show that again. And I knit a front stitch, and then I had 7 back stitches and a front stitch, and so on and so on and so on till I got to the end of the row. And when you start row 2, move your stick up and begin this time on the left. I was on my left pipe. And you begin with the slip and a front and so on, back stitches for 7, front. And that's the way I wrote it out. You can, make your own little shorthand for your, and move up your chart one row at a time. Now, I'm about to begin row 13. So, and again, I think it's easier to see the whole thing, but you don't have to do that. You can just do this. And if you email me, this is the one I'll send you. And if you expand it, this one has 19 stitches. You'll need to make it longer and bigger like I did. So I am about to begin row 13. So then my stick is just, here, whatever you use for a little marker. And I know that my first stitch is a slip stitch. Then I'll back stitch 3 and front stitch 3 and then back stitch 5. Now notice that while it's symmetrical in this case, the back stitches where I started out with 3, then it's 5 and 5 and 5. So watch your repeats once you've come away from your edge, because it will change. So just be aware of that. And then it's the same across the row until you get to the end again. So again, when you make your slip stitch and you begin, so now I'm just going to show you a little bit of the knitting tricks that I learned as I was making my last version of this. I wanted it to be tighter than my checkerboard, and I tried the US 19 size. I didn't like it, so I stuck with the US, the 1/2-inch PVC pipe that's equivalent to a US 35 needle, and I preferred that, but I made each stitch tighter just as I made my very first slip stitch. So when you make your slip stitch edge again, you're going to bring your yarn up and you're going to take your stitch off so that it looks like that. Again, it looks like a little horse face, if you will, with a little nose band, and pipe it just like that. And that's your first stitch. And then next, what I have to do is back stitch 3. And if you have your pattern, or you've made your pattern, that's what you do next for row 13. And I take my first stitch off as the pattern stitch, and I'm going to back stitch that, and I pull up firmly to make sure that that slip stitch gets tightened. And there's 1, 2, and I made a conscious effort, again, when I was making this, to really kind of firm up by pulling on this side of the new stitch, on the left side of the new stitch, to tighten up the last stitch on the pipe. And now I knit 3 front stitches, and this is the one stitch I realized I was being sloppy with, and I knew that because the purl side that was facing me looked sloppy, and I thought, hey, I need to make my stitches a little tighter. So if you find that happening to you, it should look exactly the same. Your front stitches and the back stitches should look the same on both sides if you're Afghan. If they don't, if one side of the purl side of the stockinette looks good and the other side looks sloppy, in this case it doesn't. But if it does, and one side looks baggier than the other, then you need to do a little bit better job at forming your stitches. And so what I made sure of is every time I made a front stitch and I took that off, I made my front stitch a little closer to the new stitches. And when I brought my working yarn through, I made sure I pulled on this side of the new stitch, you can see that when I do that, it tightens around the pipe. And it will look better in the end if you find that your sides aren't equal. And remember, you're working with 6 strands, so make sure that your yarn is not getting caught up. You have to comb it out from time to time. Make sure they're hanging straight, and then you have plenty of slack on all of your working yarns. And again, if you find them being overly tightened or twisted, farther down the pike, it's because of how you make your stitches. Just very slightly twist the stitch as you're going to make it. Very slightly. You'll never see that, but what it will do, if you do that for a few stitches, it will totally take the twist out of the rest of your yarn. And that's some little tips on doing your chevron. I would not use too dark of a yarn or your pattern isn't going to show. And then if you watch the next video, I'll show you how to fix a mistake when it's way back down in your knitting and how to put the tassels on. Thanks for watching.